The 40th Regiment of Foot was an infantry regiment of the British Army, formed in 1717 in Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia. After 164 years the 40th was amalgamated into the Prince of Wales's Volunteers in 1881. Following further amalgamations of British Army infantry regiments, today's direct linear descendant regiment is the Duke of Lancaster's Regiment, Nova Scotia. According to historian Harry Peers, the regiment was raised in Nova Scotia by General Richard Phillips in August 1717 out of independent companies stationed in North America and the West Indies. The regiment was first known as Phillips Regiment, Cornwallis Regiment. In 1751, the regiment was numbered the 40th Regiment of Foot and became known as 40th Hobson's Regiment. The 40th fought through Father Rail's War, King George's War, Father Lil Outers War and then the French and Indian War. During the latter war the regiment fought in the siege of Louisbourg, Quebec and Montreal and Havana. The regiment also fought throughout the American Revolution. Father Rail's War. Prior to Father Rail's War, the MIKMAQ resisted the establishment of a British fort at Cancer, Nova Scotia by raiding the fishing station in 1720. Phillips sent a company of the 40th, under the command Major Lawrence Armstrong, to take up garrison of a small fort in Cancer built by the New England fishermen. The MIKMAQ continued preying on shipping, forcing the garrison to take action in 1722. Serving as Marines, the troops and local fishermen were able to disperse the marauding Indians. The next engagement came in July 1724 when a party of 60 Indians attacked Annapolis Royal. The garrison responded with a poorly calculated sortie from the town's dilapidated fort, resulting in the death of a sergeant and private, the wounding of an officer and 3 privates, and the repulse of the troops. After some pillaging, the MIKMAQ departed with a number of civilian prisoners. From 1717 to 1743, Phillips Regiment, garrisoning Annapolis, Placentia, and Cancer, was successful in protecting settlers from Indian attacks, checking French influence in the area, and preserving the British foothold in Atlantic Canada. King George's War. At the outbreak of King George's War, the French at Louisbourg immediately engaged in the raid on Cancer. In May a flotilla containing 900 French regulars and militia, the 4 poorly supplied companies of Phillips Regiment were forced to surrender. The town was destroyed and the prisoners sent to Louisbourg. Once the regiment's officers and men were paroled in September 1744, the regiment was evacuated to Boston where they provided valuable information on the defenses of Louisbourg for the British siege the following year. Governor Shirley was having difficulty raising troops requested by Mascarene and therefore he ordered the ex-Cancer garrison to be Annapolis Royal. The Newfoundland campaign happened during August 1744. Captain Robert Young, of the 44 gunship Kinsale, lying in St. John's, Newfoundland, received intelligence that 5 French ships were in the port of Fish Otter and resolved on dispatching an armed prize to attack them. The prize was named the St. Philip, and was manned by 80 men of the Kinsale's crew, and commanded by one of her lieutenants, and accompanied by 3 10-gun colonial privateers. The St. Philip succeeded, after grounding several times, in reaching the moderate, of 12 guns and 75 men, which was boarded and carried, then turning the moderate's guns against the remaining ships, without the assistance of the privateers, compelled the whole to surrender. The St. Philip had 10 killed, and 30 wounded. The loss on board the French ships was more severe. The 5 vessels, which had on board 18,000 quintals of fish and 80 tons of oil, mounted together 66 guns, and carried 342 men. In July 1744, 300 Indians under command of a French priest named Lil Outers attacked Annapolis, the only British garrison in Nova Scotia. Only 80 men of Philip's regiment were available to meet this threat, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Paul Mascarene. Mascarene refused to surrender to Lil Outers. Lil Outers' party eventually burned a number of houses and withdrew. Following this, George II authorized the reorganization of the regiment, which increased to 6 regiments, the garrison at Annapolis, with an authorized complement of 450. Initially only 70 additional men were received. Recruitment efforts continued and Gover Shirley sent 206 recruits in February 1746. Despite the additional manpower, the regiment remained under strength. It was at this time that Captain John Winslow first took command of a Phillips regiment at Annapolis Royal, after being transferred from Newfoundland. In September, the enemy, this time 300 regulars and militia with Indian support, reappeared outside the dilapidated earthworks of Annapolis Royal. After a 4-week siege and lacking a train of artillery, the French withdrew from the defiant garrison. A force of 600 French and Indians again attempted to take Annapolis in May 1745. This demonstration ended quickly, with the French and MIKMAQ being ordered back to help defend Louisbourg from the British. The only other action seen by Philip's regiment occurred while serving as Marines and seamen. A detachment from the garrison at St. John's, Newfoundland volunteered to serve on a captured 20-gun ship for an expedition with 3 privateers to Fish Otter Bay. The prize entered Fish Otter Bay alone and engaged a number of anchored French ships. After 5 hours of fighting and the loss of 10 killed and 30 wounded, the ship had captured 3 14-gun and 2 12-gun enemy ships. 46 of their crews were killed and 332 made prisoner. The lagging privateers entered the harbour and assisted in the destruction of French fishing stages and the removal of enemy ships and prisoners. By the end of the war, Philip's regiment, after defending Britain's foothold in Nova Scotia with a skeleton complement, had its establishment raised to 70 men for each company. Men were quickly impressed in England for service in the regiment. Between 1746 and 1748, the regiment contented itself with garrison duty at Annapolis and St. John's. With a continuing problem of finding recruits in Britain for the Phillips regiment, George II took the unusual step of allowing recruitment from the colonies for the British regiment. Father Lil Outers War. The 40th was also actively engaged in Father Lil Outers War. In July 1749, the Grenadier Company under Captain Hanfield were sent to garrison the new settlement of Halifax, founded the month earlier by the new governor of Nova Scotia, Edward Cornwallis. A surprise attack by local MIKMAQ in the siege of Grand Pré resulted in the capture of a detachment of the company, including Lieutenant Hamilton and Hanfield's son. The captives were later returned to Halifax. Further engagements occurred with the Indians that year as the troops preserved the line of communication between Halifax and Annapolis Royal. Additional members of the regiment formed the garrison of Fort Sackville and established themselves at Fort Edward. By 1750, Cornwallis had taken over the colonelcy of the regiment. By the royal warrant of 1 July 1751, Cornwallis the regiment was given the numerical distinction of the 40th Regiment of Foot. Neglected for so many years by its former colonel, Cornwallis set about enhancing the condition of his new regiment. The companies in Newfoundland were rotated and discipline was improved. Desertion was poorly tolerated by Cornwallis. Of 6 deserters stationed at Fort Vieux-Logis, 2 were shot and the rest reprieved. 3 other deserters were hanged and their bodies suspended in chains as a warning to others. Further changes happened in the 40th with Cornwallis' appointment of Major Charles Lawrence of the 45th to the regiment's Lieutenant Colonel C. Lawrence proved to be an energetic and effective military and administrative leader. After his appointment, Lawrence led an expedition to the Missaguash River in August 1750, where he routed in the battle at Chignecto a superior number of Indians under Lil Outers. That fall he built Fort Lawrence across the river, where the following spring the French would build Fort Beauséjour. In 1752, Peregrine Hobson succeeded Cornwallis as Nova Scotia's governor and colonel of the 40th Regiment. In poor health, Hobson returned to England in 1753, leaving the governing of the colony to Lawrence. In 1755, Hobson officially resigned as governor and Lawrence was appointed. However, Hobson remained the colonel of the 40th Regiment until his death in 1759. French and Indian War. By 1755 it was decided that the recently erected French Fort Beauséjour had to be removed as a threat. The English force, including members of the 40th Regiment, was met by a large body of regulars and militia as they crossed the Missaquash River. This enemy force was attacked and dispersed quickly. Beauséjour was subsequently laid siege to on the 21st of June and it surrendered 4 days later. Also in 1755, under the command of John Handfield, the 40th were engaged in the expulsion of the Acadians from Annapolis Royal. After such a long stay in the colony, a number of the officers had married into the local Acadian population. Therefore, the deportation order forced officers to exile their own relations. Even the commander of the garrison, Major Handfield, had to deport his wife's sister-in-law, nephews and nieces, uncles, aunts, and cousins. Handfield wrote to another officer performing the same task, "I heartily join with you in wishing that we were both of us got over this most disagreeable and troublesome part of the service." In 1757, after 40 years in Annapolis Royal, the town where the regiment had been raised, 43rd relieved the 40th where it then went to Halifax to prepare for service in the 7 Years' War. In 1758, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Handfield, the regiment participated in the Second Siege of Louisbourg. Some companies of the regiment participated in the Louisbourg Grenadiers. In 1763 the 40th rotated out of Havana, Cuba, to Annapolis Royal where it served until 1767 when it was transferred to Britain. This would be the first time in its 48-year history that the British regiment would serve on British soil. American Revolution. The regiment fought in the American Revolution. Toward the end of the American Revolution, in 1782, the regiment took a county title as the 40th Regiment of Foot. Napoleonic Wars. The 40th was part of the force that attempted to capture Buenos Aires in 1806. After 2 years back in Britain, it was deployed to Spain and Portugal in what would become the Peninsular War, thus being one of only 3 regiments to serve throughout the entire Peninsular Campaign. Briefly sent to Canada in 1814 during the War of 1812, it was soon recalled upon the ending of that conflict. In 1815 the regiment was rushed to join with Wellington's army just before the Battle of Waterloo commenced. Initially placed in reserve, they were later in the day moved to the center of his line to a position near La Haye Sainte. They held firm all day and helped drive off Napoleon's final massed infantry attack, ultimately losing 170 killed or wounded, including their commanding officer Major Arthur Rowley Hayland. Better source needed. Australia and India. The 40th Regiment of Foot spent a number of years of duty in the Australian colonies. From 1823 to 1829, they were posted to New South Wales, where they served at both Sydney and Van Diemen's Land. They were then transferred to Bombay, with the first units of the 40th leaving Australia in 1828. While in India, the 40th was stationed in a number of places within the Bombay Presidency. In 1839 they were sent to the Sindh and took part in the capture of Karachi. The regiment then carried out operations in the Sindh against Nasser Khan. They captured the fort at Karjik in 1841. They also fought during the First Anglo-Afghan War. The regiment entered Afghanistan in 1841 and camped at Quetta on their way to Afghanistan, where they experienced one of the worst outbreaks of disease of any regiment of the British Army. They fought with General Knott during his campaign in Afghanistan in 1842. They returned to India in December 1842 and fought in the Gwalior campaign at the Battle of Maharajpur in 1843. They returned to Australia in 1852 and remained until 1860, serving in Victoria, where they suppressed the Eureka Rebellion of 1854. Detachments from the regiment were also stationed in South Australia and Western Australia. From 1860 until 1865, the regiment took part in the Taranaki and Waikato campaigns. During the New Zealand Wars. Uniforms: Grenadier, 40th Regiment of Foot, 1776. Officer and Private, 40th Regiment of Foot, 1812. Officer from the Light Company, 40th Regiment of Foot, 1826. Drummer, 40th Regiment of Foot, 1846. Colour Sergeant, 40th Regiment of Foot, 1881. Notable veterans: Otho Hamilton, John Handfield, and his son William, Peregrine Hobson, Charles Lawrence, George Street, Joe, George Scott, John Hamilton, John Graves Simcoe, Thomas Musgrave,